Waters, the history of the St. Lucie River. And this part 3 will be a little different. John's going to describe that for you. The Elliott's finishing up a very active season with many lectures, both here at the House of Refuge. And I would hope that you've enjoyed them, those of you who have attended, and we'll keep on supporting the museum into the coming year as well. I want to acknowledge that none of our lectures and programs would be possible without our sponsors. Tonight we're very lucky to have representatives from both sponsors for this lecture series. Lisa Baxter is here from WQCS. Want to raise your hand? Thanks, Lisa. We helped get the word out through some radio advertisement. And then our presenting sponsor of Wilmington Trust, we have Matt King and Anita Salas, who are sitting in the very way back. Thank you so much. We literally couldn't do it without you, and we're very, very grateful for helping us to get this information to our community. So, with that said, John, take it away.
Where am I taking it to?
You tell us.
How's everybody doing tonight? My audio technician is telling me to turn it up. Is that better? Yes. Okay. I don't want to get this thing too close to that speaker, otherwise you'll definitely hear it. This is part 3. I can't believe that we have actually made it. How many of you have been to part 1? Wow. How many to part 2? Wow. You're actually going to be able to put up with me for 3 full lectures? This is incredible. Okay. We've got some great panelists that we're going to be doing. As I mentioned before, we're going to do a town hall style meeting tonight. I want your input. We want your questions about the river, the history of the river, and especially about what we're going to try to do to save the river. We've got some very distinguished panelists that are going to help us with that, and I'm going to switch microphones because I think that one might be a little bit better. Okay. But before we do the town hall style meeting, I just wanted to do kind of a wrap up of parts 1 and 2, and also we wanted to talk about some of our environmental champions that have been champions of our environment here in Florida. And so in order to do that, let's go ahead and get right into our PowerPoint. First of all, we've already talked about some of our sponsors. Hello. Hello. There we go. And Sandra Thurlow is here in our audience as well, and I won't make you stand up, but you can wave your hand and say, there you are, okay. Just a tremendous source of historical information for me, so she's been really, really wonderful in helping us put this together. Part 1. We started talking about the beauty of the river. And the beauty of the river is not only its botanical beauty, but its wildlife as well. And some of these species of birds that you see here are very representative of what you can find on the St. Lucie River and the surrounding areas. This is one of the most unique. I call this, for those of you who don't remember, I call this picture the tango, this picture Victoria's Secret, and this picture the flamenco. And those are all the dances of the reddish egret, and the reddish egret hunts in that fashion. It tries to scare up fish by dancing around in the water, and then once it feels like it's scared up some fish, then it will spread its wings out, the fish will go underneath those wings, and it picks them off one by one. This is incredibly, incredibly rare to see in our environment right now. And yet, 100 or 200 years ago, this was commonplace. And all of these images that you're seeing are becoming increasingly rare, as we go on in time. We have a healthy population of osprey, but for how much longer? If we keep on giving these critters, such incredibly polluted and filthy water, inevitably it's going to hurt them biologically. And scenes like this may be a foregone sight, 1 generation from now. We just don't know for sure. As we originally said, St. Lucie River, it was originally a freshwater body. It wasn't until 1892 that a channel was opened up and the river was flooded with salt water, and it created a whole different type of environment, one that by pure chance happens to be an incredibly diverse environment. Dr. Grant Gilmore is going to be here to be able to address some of that with us here tonight. So in that aspect, we really lucked out. But also, by dredging the river, it created some inevitable changes. that are probably impossible to reverse. The river was originally dredged purely for the purpose of commerce. There was absolutely no consideration of the environment. In fact, you'll see that throughout the history of the St. Lucie River, as we've discovered, it was commerce first, public safety second, or public safety second, commerce first. And the idea that we could be doing something to damage our environment was, not even considered. Remember that the Treasure Coast was turned into an ecotourism spot. Our sport fishing, rather, was something that was really renowned. And we had former presidents that were coming down into this area and going back and promoting the incredible diversity of fishing and the great fishing that we had. But at the same time, we also had plume hunters that were destroying our birds by the hundreds of thousands at a time. Before the plume hunting started here in the Treasure Coast and throughout the rest of the state of Florida, it was estimated that we had 2.4 million wading birds in Florida. And by the time the plume hunting trade was done, around 1918, when we finally passed the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, that population had been reduced down to 100,000 birds. And today, that population has rebounded only to about 200,000 birds. So you can see that we have devastated that part of our ecology. And it has been extremely slow to rebound. The St. Lucie River Canal was a very, very old concept. A lot of people think that this happened, in the 40s or 50s, but in fact, the original contract for the digging of the St. Lucie Canal was signed in 1913, and the construction on it finally started in 1915. Originally, it was supposed to end at Manatee Pocket, and that was the original design for the canal. But instead, it went over to what was then called Halpatioke, which is the South Fork of the St. Lucie River. Anytime you talk about the river, you have to talk about politics. And believe me, we're going to be talking a lot about politics tonight. One of the worst politicians from an environmental standpoint was Napoleon Broward, governor at the turn of the 1900s. And he won election by the promise that he was going to drain the Everglades. And he was going to turn that into agricultural land and commercial real estate and residential real estate. And his motto was to drain the Everglades. Fortunately, it didn't quite get to that point in time. But again, there was always pressure to drain the Everglades, all the way up through the 1960s and even the early 1970s. As we said, a contract to build the original St. Lucie Canal was signed in the 19-teens, and construction began on May 28, 1915, as had been envisioned as early as 1855 to be able to form that kind of a canal. A gentleman by the name of Hamilton Diston was the first person to start dredging in our area, and he dredged the Caloosahatchee River to connect with Lake Okeechobee. And in fact, at the turn of the 1900s, there was regular steamboat service from Tampa up to Kissimmee by way of the Caloosahatchee River in Lake Okeechobee and then the Kissimmee River. So it was quite a feat that he did, and he single-handedly, was able to drain quite a large swath of our state. In our second section, in our second lecture, we talked about the hurricane of 1928. And in 1928, we had a hurricane that absolutely devastated the interior of the state. It was predicted that it would not hit Florida at all, and as a result, a lot of people weren't prepared. But even if they could have been prepared, the dike around Lake Okeechobee at the south end, around Belglade, Pahokee, Clewiston, was only 5 feet tall. And the storm surge that hit that part of the lake was so devastating that literally thousands of people were killed. We believe between 2,500 to 3,000 people were killed. Some of the destruction that you can see there, and as a result of that massive loss of life and the massive destruction, and you can see this is the area that was flooded by the hurricane in 1928 there in the south, and also up around the city of Okeechobee. So because of that, there was a public outcry. And it seems like one of the themes that you're going to hear tonight is that politicians don't listen unless there's a public outcry. Right now we have a public outcry about gun control. We recently lost 17 young students at a high school that unfortunately is named Margaret Stoneman Douglas High School. And she happened to be one of the great environmental champions of Florida. And now, unfortunately, her name is going to be not so much associated with her environmental work, but she was the namesake of the high school that 17 students lost their life at. But there's a massive public outcry about that, and things are trying to get done. Well, there was a massive public outcry about the loss of life and the loss of property in Lake Okeechobee at that point in time. And so, as a result of that, and also because in 1929, we had the 1928-29, we had the start of the Great Depression, there was a public outcry for jobs as well. And one of the great ways of creating jobs was to build infrastructure. And one of the great infrastructure projects of that time was the construction of the Herbert Hoover Dike. It seemed like it would be a no-brainer. It would be really easy to do because, after all, you know, the government was involved in other water issues as well, such as the TVA in Tennessee, such as Grand Coulee Dam in Washington State, the largest dam of its time that stood that way for several years. I mean, in all of these projects, the main central theme was controlling water. So what's the big deal about taking some dirt and building a levee and protecting the lake? Well, it took a lot more time than they thought it was going to take, I'll tell you that. They started again, you know, in the early 1930s, 31, and ongoing improvements to the dike, ongoing improvements. The dike was not officially dedicated until 1961. Wow. And the last lock, which is Port Mayaca, was not completed until 1977. So, took a long time to be able to control Mother Nature there, didn't it? But these are some of the historic photographs you can see of some of the construction. Here's a Taylor Creek Hurricane Gate, which, you know, was, you know, actually a lock, and this is the same scene in 1937. The other reason why they wanted to construct this was not only for water and flood control, but also to protect jobs. Again, in the Great Depression, we had unemployment of about 25%. 1 in 4 people in the United States were without work. And one of the great areas where you could find employment were in agricultural areas. And because Florida's climate allowed the production of agriculture year-round, the Farm Security Administration actually had large flatbed trucks that they would load people from up in the Northeast or in other areas of the country, and for between $8 and $12, these people could buy a ticket to move down into Florida and become migrant farm laborers around the Belle Glade and Pahokee area. They came by the thousands, you know, and in order to, and that's incidentally where you really see the massive development of the Everglades agricultural area. It was during that time frame. Even with all these farmers that were down there, though, the poverty was just absolutely rampant. And you can see some of the farm kids that were there, and they came from everywhere. There's from Texas. And we think of the Okies going to California, but just as many of them came to Florida as well to try to escape the rampant poverty, you know, that was taking place in the Dust Bowl. Again, you know, you would never equate that picture to Florida, would you? Not even in Belle Glade, which, you know, is traditionally, you know, an area where there's a lot of high poverty, but you just would never equate that to Florida, and yet that was rampant all over the place. So with that in mind, again, we had lots and lots of agricultural production that needed to be protected, or at least the politicians, you know, wanted it to be protected. And so the dike around Lake Okeechobee continued. It says here, the Lake O project became an ongoing effort for flood control. The initial project received a number of upgrades over the years. As I said, the last one was Port Mayaca locks in 1977. And the one thing, excuse me, that we proved by constructing all of these locks was that we simply can't control Mother Nature. If there's one thing that you want to take home tonight through this lecture series, is it's not nice to fool Mother Nature. Remember that Parquet, I think it was a Parquet butter or margarine commercial? You know, Mother Nature, all of a sudden there's this flash of lightning. It's not nice to fool Mother Nature. And, you know, well, we found out the hard way, unfortunately, through 125 years of projects and misuse of our environment. We found out the hard way. One of the last great efforts to try to control water in Florida was the straightening of the Kissimmee River. That started in the 1950s, early 60s, and what was an incredibly diverse biological treasure trove, you know, full of oxbows, bends in the curves, bends and curves in the river, to slow down water, to keep it clean. It was all straightened, turned into a major canal. There were locks that were put in there for recreational and commercial purposes. And almost before it was done, suddenly people started to wake up and they realized that, hey, you know, there's something wrong here. You know, this isn't quite right. But by that time, it had already been done. And so as a result, you know, we have scenes like this periodically here in Florida. You know, this was in 2016. But like I said, it took a lot of money, hundreds of millions of dollars. But we finally managed to totally, completely screw up our environment. And I've said this before, you know, when my wife and I were up in Alaska in 2013, you know, at one of the big algae blooms in 2013, people up there looked at us and they said, how in the world can you people in Florida be so stupid? How can you be so stupid that you have such an incredible environment? You could be managing that in such a way that your economy could be just absolutely booming with business, because people want to see the alligators, they want to see the river grass, they want to see this unique environment that is nowhere else in the world, and yet you guys are absolutely destroying it. Not to mention you're messing up your public health as well. Because, you know, we all know, we've all seen the signs where, you know, along the St. Lucie River, do not touch the water. Do people come to Florida so they don't touch the water? That's ridiculous. And yet that's the environment that we're living in today. We talked about Ernie Lyons last month, you know, as one of the first great environmental champions of the St. Lucie River. He was telling people from the 1930s on, you know, that what we were doing to the river was going to devastate our environment. He was an environmental prophet, if you will, you know, and people didn't listen. They just kept on doing what they kept on doing. Here's Ernie Lyons at a very young age. You know, he loved the river. He went out, you know, trapping, fishing, you know, and really appreciating everything that was there. This is shortly before his death, about 1990, I think it was, when he finally died. But all through his life, you know, as an editor of the Stuart News, you know, he continually wrote columns about the beauty of the St. Lucie River, you know, and what we were doing to it, and nobody paid attention. So, a great quote that we have from Ernie Lyons. I'm just going to read the last part of it. Modern man's greatest loss of spirit may be that he has ceased to be amazed at the wonders all around him. And that's what our environment is. It's just an incredible, wonderful environment. As I said, there's nothing else like it in the world. And Ernie realized that, and yet we refuse to do anything about it. So now we simply wonder why this is all around us. We wonder who's to blame. We wonder how to get rid of it. And we wonder what will be the true cost of it. And to this day, we're still wondering. We have plans in place. We have the comprehensive Everglades restoration program that has been in place for some 17 years now. But we still have these kind of scenes. So, you know, there's a great deal of wonderment, but not a whole lot of action. Okay. A few years back, in 2016, these were the scenes here in the Treasure Coast. You know, there came a critical point in time when the public finally said, enough is enough. You know, and, you know, basically, you know, remember the old phrase that some people say, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to put up with it anymore? Well, collectively, our society here started saying the same thing. We started having drives to buy the land so that we could be able to push water south. There was lots and lots of protests during that time. There were great slogans. I love that one. I wish I had a bumper sticker of that, because that's the one bumper sticker I would put on my car. And, you know, the idea was restore the flow. Well, you know, to people that don't know our environment, you know, they look at that and say, well, what flow? But again, we know that historically, you know, water from Lake Okeechobee flowed south to the Everglades and not through the St. Lucie River or the Caloosahatchee River. Again, this more pictures from the Buy the Land protest down on Stewart Beach, just, you know, right over here on the other side of the parking lot. So that brings us to one of the great topics I wanted to talk about tonight before we have our panelists in our town hall section of this meeting. There have been those who, no matter how unpopular it's been, have been champions of our environment. And one of the very first, that received national recognition was Rachel Carson. Carson rather. She published a book called Silent Spring. I'm sure that most of you probably are familiar with that book. And she had great credentials. But the one thing that she didn't have was she didn't have a male anatomy. And we laugh at that, but the three women that we're going to talk about tonight, each one of them, everybody tried to soundly put them down as being incompetent because they were female. And if there was ever a need for a Me Too movement back in those days, it was then. Because, Silent Spring was, it said, one of the first significant books of the environmental movement. It directly challenged industry and government over environmental policy. And her findings were scientifically sound. She had a background in biology, but she was also a great writer. And yet her credentials were challenged. Every attempt was made to shred her science. And she was constantly being challenged and discredited simply because she was a woman. And what can I say? And yet she discovered, that the introduction of DDT after World War II in 1945 was absolutely devastating our environment because DDT was being used to kill insects. And yet those insects are part of the base of our food chain for a lot of other animals. She originally wanted to write a series of articles in the Reader's Digest in 1945 about the threat of DDT, and the Reader's Digest refused to take it. And it wasn't until 1958 that she finally decided, to get back into the game, so to speak, and start working on her book. When it finally came out, it was a runaway bestseller, and it scared the ever-loving daylights out of the establishment industry and the establishment government, and that's why they tried to put her down. But the theme there is that she didn't let it get to her. She kept it up, she kept on trying, she kept on standing by her guns, and ultimately she was incredibly successful. Here in Florida, we had a really interesting scenario, and I really wish that Nathaniel Reed was with us right now, and he would have been, but he had a prior speaking engagement with a high school tonight. But about 3 or 4 weeks ago, my wife and I spent the afternoon with Nathaniel Pryor Reed at his home in Jupiter Island, and Nate Reed is a great environmental champion of our state, and we'll talk about him a little bit more in a few minutes. But he got in on the fight for the Cross Florida Barge Canal. Before I started doing the research on this program, I didn't even know that there had been such an attempt to build a canal. What the Cross Florida Barge Canal was an attempt to take a big swath of land, and it would be completely, destroyed, through the use of this crusher crawler. That's a man right there, by the way. Look at how big that thing is. I mean, that thing would take anything out. And it did. And they were going to turn that into a large canal that they could do coal shipments from the Gulf of Mexico, coal and oil, but predominantly coal, and take it across the northern part of the state, up through the St. Johns River and then up the East Coast. This was proposed, it had been proposed several times, but finally, in the early 1960s, President Kennedy was going to give the money to the state of Florida in return for all the votes that he got to help get him elected. The money was not able to be transferred over to Florida as a political payback, if you will, before his assassination. But President Lyndon Johnson didn't forget that. And so he decided that he would go ahead and sanction and fund the Cross Florida Barge Canal. And it says here on this site, President Lyndon Johnson dedicated the start of construction of the 185-mile-long canal on February 27th, 1964. So not too long after President Kennedy's assassination. Here are some of the pictures of the construction that was going on. It was determined later on by an environmentalist that the whole premise of building this canal was ridiculous. The reason why they wanted to ship coal through this canal, believe it or not, was they were afraid that Russian submarines were going to sink all of our ships that were going around the Florida Keys and up the East Coast, like the German U-boats did during World War II. Remember, this is the Cold War era. You remember in 1963 we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. So As stupid as that sounds today, you know, there was maybe just a shred of political credibility to that argument. But it was discovered that the canal would be so small and so shallow that the major coal barges that entered over here in the Gulf of Mexico would have to transfer their loads to smaller barges, and then it would have to be retransferred once it got up into Jacksonville, and it became became economically unviable, and it just didn't seem to work. And yet, because it was a politically funded project, the work continued on it. Well, about that time, a lady by the name of Marjorie Harris Carr, who had a background in biology, in fact, she was an incredible woman because she was the very first person to receive a bachelor's degree in biology from Florida State University. She had to fight to get in because at the time the university was an all-male institution for the biology department. But she got her degree. And she was instrumental, shortly after she got her degree, in doing a lot of environmental work. For example, even as a trained scientist and activist, she was instrumental in saving the Paynes Prairie State Park area that we have today. It was going to be, pretty much destroyed and leveled as part of a highway project, but she was able to get a group of people to help save that. And she did that, by the way, as the president of the Gainesville Garden Club. You know, you think that the positions like that aren't important? You can make them as important as you want to, you know. And she did that not as a scientist, but as an activist. So really incredible. She opposed the construction of the Cross Florida Barge Canal. She was born in 1915 in Bonita Springs. They moved to Bonita Springs in 1918. Both of her parents were naturalists, which was really important for her because from a very early age, she was able to understand the importance of our environment. Again, she earned a degree from, it says Florida State College of Women, which actually turned out to be FSU later on in 1932. She graduated in 1936 with a bachelor's degree in zoology. But because she was a woman, she was excluded from any graduate studies. It wasn't until several years later that she was finally accepted into University of Florida, and she got a degree from them. But during the Great Depression, and I found this interesting, during the Great Depression, there was a federal law that said you could only have one job per household. And when she decided to move, she originally started working at a fishery, and when she found a better job at a different location, she had to disclaim her marriage. She couldn't tell people that she was married because if it was found out that she was married to Archie Carr, then she would not be eligible for the job. And so Archie, her husband, and herself, they agreed to keep the marriage quiet so that she could continue working. How's that for discrimination against women? So, what can I say? And so she started working at the Willaca National Fish Hatchery shortly after her graduation. This gave her an opportunity to study the hope I can pronounce this right, Ocklawaha? Sounds good. Okay, Ocklawaha River near Ocala. And that became the basis of her studies that she used to help fight against the Cross Florida Barge Canal later on. She married Archie Carr in 1937, as I said, but in the fall of 1937, she entered the all-male University of Florida's graduate biology program, again, as the first woman to do so. So she was groundbreaking in that area as well. She became a board member and eventually the president of the Gainesville Garden Club. And in 1957, again, she was instrumental in saving Paynes Prairie, as the president of the Gainesville Garden Club. She was co-founder of the Alachua County Audubon Society. Yay, Audubon. And we got some Audubon people. We got Audubon people in the crowd, too. All right. In 1960. And in 1969, she helped form Florida Defenders of the Environment. And that was the environmental activist group, together with the Audubon chapter, that together they started creating the documentation that they needed to fight the Cross Florida Barge Canal. And interestingly enough, her group wrote the very first environmental impact statement. Today, we take the environmental impact statement for granted when it comes to large major projects. They wrote the first one. And it was so good that people from the federal government came down to look at that, and they used that as the first model for environmental impact statements that came to follow on other projects. So the Cross Florida Barge Canal project was finally stopped on January 19th of 1971 because of their activism. So from a garden club president to the president of a local Audubon chapter, which a lot of people consider to be nothing but birding clubs, this woman changed our environment for the good. And she not only changed our environment here in Florida, but she set a precedent nationally for what needed to be done in order to help save our environment in other areas as well by the creation of the environmental impact statement. And yet all the way through her career, again, she was soundly ridiculed for being a woman. She couldn't have been that important because she was a woman. Her scientific data couldn't have been that accurate because she was a woman. Everything about her career, people were trying to put her down and put her down and put her down. When I was talking with Nathaniel Reed, we were doing a videotape interview with him. He was part of this, and he was working with Marjorie Carr during that time to help put this down. And it turned out that his connections with the federal government, in this case, he was actually serving as Assistant Secretary for the Interior for President Nixon. And President Nixon, once he found out that Lyndon Johnson had given the money for the canal, he had a few choice expletives. And he said, no, I'm going to show that guy whatnot. And he decided that as payback, he would stop funding of the canal and stop the project altogether because it was Democratic pork barrel. We all know what Nixon was like, though. So anyhow, that's what happened in that situation. Archie Carr went on to say this. As others have noted from time to time, the story of Marjorie Carr is the story of the conservation movement in Florida. The struggle to defeat the Cross Florida Barge Canal was one of the first great confrontations of the Army Corps of Engineers in American environmental history. When people in Washington, D.C. wrote the Environmental Policy Act, they came to Florida to consult with Marjorie and the Florida Defenders of the Environment. They came to study a document called an Environmental Impact Statement, the first of its kind in America, a technical assessment of the threat posed by the canal to the water, wildlife, and human welfare in the midsection of our state. Quite a statement. Now, I know that's from her husband, but every single thing, every single fact that he wrote about is absolutely true. From a canal to a supersonic transport, how do we get from one extreme to the other? It all involves the Everglades. And I have a personal connection on this as well, because I was a teenage kid in Seattle when the Boeing supersonic transport was first proposed. And there was a great fanfare and excitement that the Boeing SST, this is a full-size mock-up that sat in a hangar in Seattle for several years, it was going to be developed because after all, by golly, if those crazy French and English can build the Concorde, we can build it faster and better. And so that's what they were going to do. But in the middle of all that, some people in Dade County said, well, this SST is coming, and that's what they used to call it. The SST is coming, and we need a bigger and better airport. In fact, we're going to build the world's first supersonic transport airport. And what better place to build it where we can have huge runways? We'll just plop it right smack dab in the middle of the Everglades. And that was their proposal. And guess what? That's exactly what they started to do. The construction started around 1968. It says here, near this site, ground was broken September 18th, 1968 for the world's first all-new jetport for the supersonic age. And it was supposed to have several runways. It was supposed to have such a large infrastructure that it was projected that just the raw sewage from that development in a single day would be approximately 10 million gallons that would be dumped into the Everglades. Needless to say, that didn't sit too well. And one of the people that was convinced that this project was a boondoggle was Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. She was 79 years old when she was convinced and asked to take on the defeat of this project. That's my other point. I don't care how old you are You know, in the defending of our environment, there is no such thing as retirement. I'm sorry. You can keep on collecting your Social Security, and I'm almost there, by the way. You know, but as defenders of our environment, there is no such thing as retirement, and Marjorie Stoneman Douglas proved it. This is a brochure for the jetport, and this is the only runway that was ever built at the jetport. They don't even have any infrastructure to support it. This runway, by the way, is used to this day, but it's used for jet pilot training, and that is it. It never saw a single passenger, commercial paying passenger, land at the runway. It became apparent to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, to Nathaniel Reed, and other environmentalists here that the whole project was a boondoggle. You know, and not only that, but it was going to absolutely devastate the last remaining section of the Everglades. And so they worked hard and fast and furious to get that defeated, and they finally did. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas was a really amazing and interesting character. She was a crusty old soul, let me tell you. You know, and she had to be, because in every step of her career, again, she was being soundly put down and criticized because she was a woman. You know, and that was nothing to her but a crock of petrified you-know-what. She graduated from Wellesley College in 1908 with a bachelor's degree in English. She didn't have any biological background, any biology training or scientific training whatsoever. She came to 1915 in order to escape a failed marriage to a con artist. It turns out that the man that she married was probably already married and had another family in and of himself, and that was a guy by the name of Mr. Douglas. Why she kept his last name, I'm not sure. But after it was discovered that her new husband was trying to con money out of her uncle, then her family encouraged her to go down to Miami, where her father, which she hadn't seen in some 10 or 15 years, happened to be the first publisher of a newspaper that would turn out to be the Miami Herald. And so she came down there to Miami. The entire population of Dade County at the time was approximately 5,000 people. So, I mean, she was definitely a pioneer, let me tell you. She came to Miami in 1915. She started working for her father, and again, in the paper that became the Miami Herald. She wrote a column in the Miami Herald titled The Gallery. And basically, you know, if you had a job in a paper and you were a woman at that time, you could be the society columnist. And that's basically what she was. She was a society columnist. But it got to be so boring for her that she started making up fictitious people to write about. It really, you know, it really got, you know, people reading and thinking, oh, who is that person? And they would ask her, well, who is this person? I've never met them. Oh, they just moved in. You haven't met them yet. But her column became so famous and so well read that, you know, that she was able to eventually take that column and push it off into other directions. She recognized early on that the Everglades was a special place, and she was one of the original champions of promoting the Everglades as a river of grass. She was the one that coined that phrase, a river of grass, in her book that was published in 1947. She was one of the original promoters of creating the park. And like I said, at the age of 79, she took up the challenge of stopping the Miami Jetport project. She would not let anything get in her way. And she continued almost up to her dying day until she was 108 years old to champion our environment. So again, if you think you're off the hook, you know, you got another thing coming to you. Just because you're collecting Social Security, that doesn't mean diddly squat. Then there's Nathaniel Pryor Reed, and Nate Reed is such a cool guy. Like I said, 3 or 4 weeks ago, my wife and I had the privilege of going to his home and spending the afternoon with him. He is a remarkable, remarkable character. He grew up in a home of privilege. You know, his family was very wealthy. They bought Jupiter Island, and then they parceled out Jupiter Island in real estate deals. And his mother was the original socialite chairperson that would allow or disallow a person to move onto the island. So it was kind of interesting. But they made their money in real estate, but from a very early age, and Nate said that he was born in Connecticut, bit, but when he was 8 or 9 years old, they moved down to Jupiter Island for good. And from a very early age, his parents recognized the love and passion that he had for wildlife and the river. And so they would allow him to go out they would arrange for guides to take him out on the river, and he loved to go fishing and go all around the Indian River Lagoon and the St. Lucie River. One of these, in the film, by the way, that we're putting together, we'll have that Nathaniel Reed, part of the Nathaniel Reed interview in that, you'll find it really special. Again, he became an avid lover of nature. He served as advisor to 6 Florida governors and 3 United States presidents. He helped draft some of the very first legislation in Florida that recognized the importance of our natural places. He was able to show Florida governors that, one of which was Ruben Askew, for example, that our attempts to re-engineer our natural water system had horribly backfired, and that created a whole set of new priorities within the state. He joined the movement to stop the development of the Miami Jetport, and again, he joined the efforts of Marjorie Carr to stop the development of the Cross-Florida Barge Canal. He's still active today as an environmentalist. In fact, he just got done writing a new memoir called Travels on the Green Highway. Strongly encourage you to buy a copy of it because it's just a remarkable document that tells of his history in the environmental movement. And it will encourage you, believe me, to become an activist. So what will happen in the next 125 years? Well, like I said, I don't know, but it's interesting to see what happened in the last 125 years. Climate change could alter our coastline. Saltwater intrusion in the Everglades could dramatically alter our overall ecosystem, as it's already starting to do. Will the waters of Lake Okeechobee ever flow south again? Not if Big Sugar has anything to do with it. You remember I had a little lunch meeting with a lady by the name of Judy Sanchez, who is the communications director for U.S. Sugar. And she flat out said, and I'm paraphrasing the quote, but she flat out said, "You will never get 1 drop of water moving south." That's how staunchly opposed, to our idea of getting water moving south through the Everglades, U.S. Sugar is. Will we ever permanently stop the water discharges out through the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie rivers? As Marjorie Stoneman Douglas said, it's a race between man's intelligence and his stupidity, and I don't know which will win. That's, what can I say? We're at the point now where we know that what used to be a natural flow of water is now, we've become one of the 2 toilet bowls of Florida. And I hate to say it that way, but it's true. All the junk moves through the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie River, and it's more polluted than it ever has been. So we have a couple of things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, and we're going to talk about Senate Bill 10. I'm just going to give you a brief preview here, and then we're going to have our panelists come up. And at that point in time, by the way, we can turn on the lights when our panelists come up here, and we're going to really get down into the nitty-gritty here. 1999, the Army Corps of Engineers submitted a plan for the partial restoration of the Everglades ecosystem. It's called the SERP, as we like to call it, Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. It was actually signed by your friend and mine, William Jefferson Clinton. Remember that guy? Yeah, he was the one that signed it and put it into action. It's been that long ago. The size of the Everglades has already been dramatically reduced. By the time this was signed, 68 plant and animal species were already threatened or endangered at the time of this first report. Wading bird population in the Everglades had been reduced by 90%. Important fish species, if I can talk, were in steep decline. Seagrass beds were in decline. And at the time of its signing, when SERP was approved and signed by Bill Clinton, it was projected that it would take 30 years to perform the restoration at a cost of $10.3 billion. I believe the latest estimates on that are now approaching $30 billion, if I'm not mistaken, and maybe some of our panelists will be able to give us the real figures on that. Comprehensive Everglades program, its goal is to use the best available science to restore the right quantity, quality, timing, and distribution of fresh water. This comes right from the federal documents, by the way. The only problem is everybody can't agree on what the right quantity, quality, timing, and distribution of fresh water is. And that becomes a big problem. There were, at the time of its writing, 68 components included in this project for the redirecting of water, the opening of the Tamiami Trail, the water flows, and the closure of canals that were originally designed to help drain the Everglades. There have been numerous alterations and amendments to SERP, and again, hopefully we'll hear a little bit more about that. Additionally, water quality issues are huge. Just ask the Miccosukee Indians. Starting in 1988, the tribe started suing, very successfully, by the way, the Army Corps of Engineers, the state of Florida, South Florida Water Management, anybody who seemed to be responsible, because, basically polluted water. What water was coming into the Everglades was so polluted that they felt like it was not sustainable. It was going to damage the environment. Historically, about 450 billion gallons of water would flow through the Everglades on an annual basis. And at the time of this report that I was reading, that number had been reduced down to 260 billion gallons when it was not polluted. And then recently we just got done hearing a lot about Senate Bill 10. Approved last year, it would create another storage reservoir or reservoirs. Its original incarnation was to be about 60,000 acres. I think that's been reduced down to about 30,000 acres. And there's still no definitive, size, I guess you could say, for that at this point in time. STAs, by the way, you'll hear us talk about STAs quite a bit. That stands for Stormwater Treatment Area. And the Senate Bill 10 was basically formed to build a series of stormwater treatment areas or a larger stormwater treatment area to reduce the pollutants in the water. STAs work very good at reducing pollutants in the water. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more. Studies have been made suggesting the implementation of deep water injection wells as well to reduce outflows, which I think is a horrible idea, but that's just me. And finally, it says here, will the Everglades agricultural area ever be reduced in size and returned to water storage? That is the big question. At one point in time, we were ready to buy about 180,000 acres of the 500,000 acres that are in production, but that deal fell through because of our economy. This is an interesting little footnote. A little while ago, I was at our state Audubon convention, and they had a representative from the Army Corps of Engineers that was at a meeting. And I was one of the lucky few that got to answer a question, or ask a question of this guy. And I said, just out of curiosity, how much water would a proposed SB10 reservoir hold? And, and what does that translate into as far as gallons and acre feet, et cetera, et cetera? Well, any way I asked the question, he refused to answer it. He just couldn't come up with a calculation. So I went to Google, and I found out that through Google that there are 325,000, roughly 326,000 gallons of water in a 1 acre foot. And I just put this all in a spreadsheet. And I started doing some calculations. And I may be horribly wrong, but I don't think I am. That if you had a reservoir that was 30,000 acres, and you had a storage capacity of 15 feet of water, 15 feet in depth, that would give you a total storage capacity of 450,000 acre feet of water. That translates into 9.775 billion gallons of water. If you do the math for the number of days, if you start calculating the number of days of water retention that it would prevent from going out through the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie River, in this formula, that would reduce our discharges by about 36 days. It's an active spreadsheet, and you can put all kinds of different variables in there. But I started thinking 36 days worth of water retention for all that money. It's a start. It's a good idea. And again, there's all kinds of variables to that. But there's lots of things that are going on with Senate Bill 10 that could change those formulas quite a bit. So at this point in time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Grant Gilmore. And we're going to turn on this microphone. And I'm sorry I only have one microphone for each of you. Yeah, we can scoot this over now.
can guess which one is which.
Okay. Celeste, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to ask you to just introduce yourself and give an opening statement about what you do and why you're here.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Oh, sounds loud. I'm Celeste De Palma. I'm with Audubon, Florida, and I recently just became the director of our Ad-Release Policy program, so I'm very proud to be here sitting with my colleague Paul Gray and the rest of our esteemed panelists who I really admire. So the reason I'm here is because John asked me to come and talk a little bit about advocacy, right, and why we do this. And so I thought, what could I share that, you know, my colleagues could not say better than I can, right? I have not been involved in advocacy for as long as they have, but I certainly do plan to do so. This has been a passion of mine for many, many, many years. Ever since I can remember, I loved the environment. But as you can probably hear it in my voice, I'm not from the United States. I was born and was raised in Argentina. And so when I was little, even though I loved the environment, I realized very early on that I probably was not going to be able to make a living out of caring for the planet in my native country. And so it wasn't really until I came to the States and I was about to graduate from college that I realized, you know what? I think I can do this. If there's one place in the world where I could just take a leap of faith and change, you know, routes and try to just do something because I love it, it's in this country. And so I said, well, okay, I'll just finish my biology degree, and then I'll just start volunteering and just see what I can do, right? And lucky for me, I landed in Audubon, and I landed with both feet on the ground, and it's just been a whirlwind and quite the journey. And I can tell you that it's very difficult to work in environmental advocacy, right? There are many, many, many defeats. And so in my line of work, especially during these political times, I try to remind myself of the victories. What have we been able to do? Even if it's little, even if it's incremental, what have we been able to do? Because if you experience nothing by defeat, if you just say, oh man, I really wanted this, but I got nothing, and you don't recognize what you've been able to do, then all of a sudden you're going to just stop fighting. You're going to get tired. You're going to become desensitized. And if you stop fighting, you know, we lost one more advocate. And so I try to remind myself every day, okay, what have we been able to do? What did we accomplish? All right, we can push a little more. And so I use those little victories to keep that fire going, to help me push forward, push for more, and get to that incremental goal for, you know, the bigger picture. So I try to do that. And yet, it's so easy to fall into this perfectionist trap, right? So easy. And I'll tell you a little story. John mentioned Parkland, the shooting. And you know, I have friends that have little kids that they drop off to school every day. My boyfriend teaches at a university, so it hit really close to home, and I got scared, and so I started really following the issue. And when I realized that we had passed gun legislation, the first thought that came through my mind, I was just furious. I said, this is nothing. And I caught myself saying that, and I said, wait a minute, is it? And I didn't know. But this was the first piece of legislation, significant changes, in 20 years. In 20 years, and these kids were able to do it in less than a month. That is, wow, that's crazy. So how easy is it for us to just fall down that trap and get lost in the details and not realize what was able to be achieved, right? It's not that the bill is perfect, certainly not by my standards, right? And this is just my personal thoughts on the issue. But it's certainly not perfect, but this gives you an in. This lets you come back next year and keep pushing for more. This now makes it a political issue for everybody that's running for office in the coming elections. This is what we needed, that little opening so we can push the door wide open. And so that's what I try to see in the work that we do every day, because it could be very taxing, right? And so when I see what this community has been able to do in the past 2 years with Senate Bill 10, for example, it's is just amazing, right? Especially when you think about the Everglades as a whole. It's a very complex watershed. And for a long time, it's been very difficult to sell it as one. And I feel that right now, that's why the community is being so strong. Because it's no longer just the estuaries fighting on their own, trying to get a little bit further estuary on the east or on the west side, and it's not just Florida Bay by itself, and it's not just Lake Okeechobee by itself. It's everybody saying, no, no, we have a big problem, and we need a solution for all of it. And we have a plan, right? We have SERP. But in order for that plan to work, it needs a lot of people to just make a lot of noise. And it needs that fuel, that fire, that constant, that squeaky wheel. Because otherwise, when you realize that we have elected officials that come and go all the time, so it becomes a matter of constantly educating these elected officials so that they get the picture, so that they feel emboldened by the community and by the NGOs with the information that they need to then be able to take that step and say, you know what, I'm gonna take this. And so I'm definitely very encouraged by the point in time that we are right now in the history of Everglades restoration, because you see the effects of people coming together in the likes of, champions in the legislature like Senator Bradley, like Senator Joe Negron, who said, I'm gonna take this to the finish line. And man, I was in Tallahassee when we were trying to pass Senate Bill 10, and it was rough. To this day, it's kind of like, do not mention SB 10, because everybody's like, okay, we did it, it's just not touch it, right? And now, I think it's important to recognize the point in time where we are, where, Judy Sanchez might say, you're never gonna get a drop of water, but you know what? We passed this bill May 2015. It's now March 2020, I'm sorry, we passed it in 2017. It's now not even a year since we passed that bill, and we have a plan. Is it perfect? Is it what we all wanted? Well, maybe not, but I think that it's also important to recognize the incremental wins that we get, and the ins that allow us to then keep pushing forward and get more, right? And what do I mean by that? We now have a plan for this reservoir, and we have, personally, I believe that we have assurances and safeties built into this project that allow us to say, we were promised X, Y, Z benefits, and then if those ones are not working for some way, or for some reason, then we need to explore what's happening and adjust, right? And a lot of what's involved with Everglades restoration is really adaptive management, especially when you talk about things like sea level rise. I mean, we passed a lot of SERP projects knowing far less than what we know now, and with a lot less details than what we have going into just this one project, right? And the Elliott Reservoir is just one piece of the puzzle. We have 68 projects in SERP, and many other that were outside of that plan. So I definitely feel encouraged and emboldened by how the community has come together. And I think that we are in a very important place in time to get a lot of momentum and get a lot of projects in the ground. And it's actually exciting because I was looking at the list of projects, and a lot of components are going to be coming to fruition in 2018. So we're going to hopefully see ribbon cuttings, which then we could use to keep that momentum going forward. Because there is such a thing as Everglades fatigue, right? We passed this SERP in the year 2000, and how many years and what do we get for our money? Well, seeing those projects in the ground is really essential for us to be able to get the ecological benefits that we're looking for, but also to complete the whole plan. Because it is a great plan, but it needs to get in the ground. So I, for one, I'm grateful for being given the opportunity to be here today, but also for being part of this journey. So that is my take.
All right, thank you. All right, let's put that microphone over to Dr. Paul Gray. And Paul, if you can introduce yourself, please.
All right, yes, I'm Paul Gray. I work for Audubon. This is my boss. I'm a staff scientist in our Everglades program, and so Audubon's model is we try to base everything we do in science, but science isn't everything. You know, you do the numbers and you look at the reservoir and say, we think it's going to work great, or maybe whatever. But I try to give as good of a idea of the numbers to Celeste and our policy team, and then they go do the lobbying and try to do that with the reinforcement from our technical people. So it's really a great formula, and I really like working, and it's great to have young people who are so energetic. Audubon's been around for more than 100 years, and actually it was because of Clara Domerich in Orlando, or actually Maitland, yeah, who founded the Florida Audubon Society, and she was married to a rich man. Of course, she couldn't vote back in the 1890s, but she had a lot of connections and influence, and even Teddy Roosevelt was on the original board of the Florida Audubon Society. And John mentioned that by 1900, there were only about 100,000 plume birds left because we pretty much shot them all. And we hired wardens, Audubon did, and Guy Bradley was one of our first wardens that got murdered in the Everglades, and Columbus McLeod got killed in Sarasota County, and there's a guy up in South Carolina that got killed and all that. My position actually started in Okeechobee in 1936, so we're in the 82nd year of my program.
So you've been working there since 1936?
I've only been working there for 23 years or something like that.
Well, I was going to say, you look great for your age.
Well, I show a picture of Marvin in some of my talks. I say, this is me back in the 1930s. Everybody's like, really? After we got the wardens going, and after we got the laws passed to protect the plume birds, they actually built up to about 500,000 birds. There was a rookery, Cuthbert Rookery, in the 1940s that had 500,000 birds again in it. But then we passed the CNSF project, and we drained the Everglades, and then they went back down again. So now we got a new problem. And as Celeste said, you know, this is a long project. This is our water management infrastructure. And we built it we designed it in 1949, and what we have now is that infrastructure. And we really have not significantly upgraded it since. And so imagine if you had one of those cars out there you got from 1949, you'd look cool driving around in it, but would it really be very good for you to get around in Florida right now? We need to upgrade our system, and it takes a long time because the volumes of water are staggering. But we have to do this because we already have raging water problems. And as environmentalists, we don't always have as much money. We don't have all the, you know, when you're fighting industries, they have lobbyists, they have everything. But when you go out and look at the Indian River Lagoon, and it's bright green like it was in 2016 and toxic, and then in 2017 it was brown because Okeechobee got all stirred up, it was all muddy, we're right. This isn't acceptable, and we need to change it. So no matter how much money and how much fight experience and other stuff we fight against, when you're right, you actually have a really strong thing to say, and people hear it, and it just takes perseverance. So I'll be quiet for now and pass it over to the best citizen of Martin County.
I'm going to stand up for a minute because I would like you to pass something out. Pass these out. Sure. I appreciate it. So I think I'm going to stand up so you can see me. I've lived my whole life as a short person, trying to be seen. So the way the seating is here, I think it will be more interesting to you if you can see me a little bit. My name's Jackie Thurlow Lippish. And first of all, I want to say hello to my mother and father, who are here in the audience, Sandy and Tom. And I grew up here in Martin County, and I'm here also to speak about advocacy. And I have to say that, like all things in life, everything starts in the family. Everything starts in the family. And it was my mother and father who taught me to love my community and to love nature that made me an advocate. And I didn't start out thinking I'd be an advocate. I was a teacher, then I became a real estate agent, then in later life I ran for political office, and that advocate kind of came out of what was deep inside of me, of what had been put inside me when I was a kid. I remember when I was a kid, my parents sometimes, Stuart was so small back in the 60s, and we would wake up in the morning, and my parents would have been out at night, and we'd wake up and they'd say to Jackie, Jenny, and Todd, there's something in the trash can. And like we'd walk over and look in the trash can, and there might like be a snake or a baby raccoon that had gotten lost, and then we'd raise it and take it to the wildlife center or whatever. But from a very early age, I was taught to love and connect with my environment. And you all, as grandparents or as parents or as people, I don't have kids, but I know I can still reach people. It's what we instill in people, that love, that passion, that builds. And so the card that I passed out to you, it's for river kids. And when I was mayor in the town of Sewell's Point in 2010, River Kids started authentically with my niece, Evie Flaw, and a neighbor, Naya Mader. And the girls sold lemonade on the side of the street, and it was Eve Samples from TC Palm who wrote an article saying that the Rivers Coalition, which is a bunch of grumpy old guys mostly, of which I am a member, that they needed younger people to get involved. And the kids heard the parents talking about it, and they were like, well, we could help out, we could join. So when they raised their $35 from their lemonade stand, they donated it to the grumpy old men at the Rivers Coalition. And Eve Samples wrote this funny column back then that said, the Rivers Coalition wanted new members, but I don't think they had any idea they were going to get this new of members. And the River Kids really, I think, revitalized the Rivers Coalition and the river movement in Martin County. And the kids, they did it themselves. They had Facebook. They started all this stuff. They threw, protest out at the locks. They did it themselves. And then, believe it or not, 2013 happened, which was the first time in a long time that we had a really bad algae outbreak and months of black water from Lake Okeechobee. And then, of course, again, it happened in 2016. And I always like to tell the kids, and my sister just pointed out to me today, that next year, those first generation river kids will start voting. And yes. So how quickly that happens, that these kids are voting, and nothing against SERP or SEP or politics, but man, that stuff is so slow. We can do so much by just investing in young people and education and youth. And these generations come up so quickly, and they can change the world not only through their hearts, but through their vote. And I also want to say that Ernie Lyons has been a great inspiration to me through my family and history. And this is a quote that I wanted to add to John's. It says, what men do, because back then it was men, and that's okay. What men do, they can undo. And the hope of our rivers is in the hundreds of men and women in our communities who are resolved to save the St. Lucie River. And it is in the people, it is in the children. We can do this. And how you get to them is you warm up to powerful politicians, and you keep pushing and pushing and pushing and telling them how important this is to you. And then you get the little kids to write notes to them. It's all over. It starts happening, and that's what happened to Joe Negron, and that's what's happened to others, and it's like a domino effect, and we can undo what we have done. We just have to keep passing it along to the next generation.
Well, I'm Dr. Grant Gilmore, and first of all, I'd like to thank John for doing this. I think it's a great thing. I've been around for a while, long enough that I look at Celeste and Jackie as the generation carrying a torch here. The younger ones you were talking about, of course, you know. But I actually knew some of the people John was talking about and was around when they were doing their thing. We moved to Florida in 1950, and we lived in Orlando, about 4 blocks from downtown, in an orange grove. Grapefruit grove, I should say. And I caught my first coral snake then. Somebody's upset on the front row here. And of course, when you lived in Florida then, you had snakes, you had creatures all over you and everywhere. I actually rode alligators when I was a kid. But I grew up in Sarasota, and there really weren't many people in Florida, as John pointed out. And we were surrounded by creatures. So we became attached to the creatures. I was going to be an aeronautical engineer and go to Mars, land on the moon. I went to the University of Florida to do that, actually. Then I took a biology course and whoa, where have I been? I was in the water all my life, so made a turn. All my graduate work was on the Gulf Coast of Florida, from Pensacola to the Dry Tortugas. And I landed this job at a sand pit over here that was eventually going to be a marine laboratory called Harbor Branch. As one of their first employees.